Why I wanted to give this no more example today is because it provides a lot of insight into process setting and process rules. For example, acquirer B, one that was at 1.85 billion SEK and used the shutdown move, they attempted to change the process rules, right? Accept our bid today or otherwise we're out the door. That wasn't my rule. As a process setter, I certainly didn't want them to have the opportunity to do that. And unfortunately for them, I think in many circumstances, had they done a shutdown move earlier in the process, maybe not the no more process, because I don't think we would have accepted the 1.85 billion, but an appropriate time to use a shutdown move is way earlier in the process. If you wait until the very end, if in fact we didn't have any of their buyers, that was acquirer B saying, I don't think there's any buyers at this level. I think we're the only one here. So quit messing around, take our number, or we're out the door. Unfortunately for them, it backfired. The use of the Dutch auction is leaning into process. Again, you have decisions to make always. Whenever you start a formal sell-side process, you on the sell side, you're the process setter. But you're always negotiating process and substance, right? You're negotiating the process rules, but you're also negotiating the substance, so the terms and price of the transaction. And to whatever extent you can lean into process and allow that to do your negotiating for you, you should do it. As I think back to that transaction, I was at the point where we instituted the Dutch auction where I was almost prepared to negotiate one-on-one because we felt like there was a little bit more gas in the tank. And we didn't think a traditional ascending price English auction would get it done. We didn't think that buyers would really revise their bid forward based on not only the activity that we saw, like the decreasing bid increments, the moaning we heard from buyers directly, as well as them desiring to have one-on-one negotiations with us. So I didn't feel like another round or a survival round was going to be the way to go. And that's why we went the Dutch auction route. And so I think for our purposes, you should always attempt to control the process the best that you can. You need to fight the shutdown moves from the other side, which will inevitably happen. But just remember, you want to stay in control of this process. However, the longer you do this and the more experience you have, the more judgment you'll have. And you have to always keep in mind that these aren't hard and fast rules. Some of these rules are meant to be broken. And I always tell folks, lean into process as much as you can, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You've got to have balance. You've got to actually pay attention to what the bidders are actually doing. Pay attention to the flow. Pay attention to the bid increments and use your best judgment as to whether you need to lean more into process or whether you actually need to go on to, for example, one-on-one direct negotiations, or entirely change the process completely. Change from an English auction to a Dutch auction. Do it one morning overnight over coffee, wake up, change the process. You have the ability to do that, but it's something that you learn over time with judgment. You as a seller need to be an active participant in your own process and work directly with your advisor. As I mentioned, prior to management meetings, one buyer stood pat and we had a disagreement. The client actually said they should be booted from process. Now, they're ultimately the acquirer that won the deal at the end at 1.93 billion. But there was a disagreement. They said they should not be rewarded for standing pat and just reconfirming their bid. And again, sometimes you just have to feel the flow and try to keep people into the process, to continue to invest in the process and give them the ability to increase their price later on in the process. I was informed largely on this one based on what the acquirer constantly said. No one can pay more than us. We can create the most value. We want this deal. They were particularly difficult to deal with, and they were the acquirer I went to first with the 2.1 billion SEK counteroffer, and they laughed at me, actually. Literally, if you look at this email above, I literally sent this over to them and they laughed at me. But within a few days, we're ultimately the prevailing bidder here. I mention this because it's important for sellers to actually be actively involved in the process with their advisors and have these conversations. And if you feel like if something in your gut tells you to do something different, bring it up. But at the end of the day, I do respect clients who can listen to reason and see the value that their advisors, if they have sophisticated advisor, can bring to the table and override these sorts of decisions. Because believe me, there's nothing more than I wanted to do is boot these guys. When they reconfirmed their bid before management, I wanted them out. I would have loved to call them and say, you're losing, you're out, you're done, you're out of the process. But at the end of the day, I have to think about what's the greater goal. And that's all about like the whole emotional detachment from this. Now, as an advisor, you can sit down and listen to your client who is disappointed, who's pissed that you reconfirmed their bid, that they didn't increase their bid. And now we're going to sit down with them and waste time at the management meeting? No, those guys can piss off. And you have to stand back and look at the bigger picture and say, okay, unfortunately, we're sending the wrong signal now by allowing them to come in. But it's potentially more of a negative for us if they're out. So let's let them ride and let's try to correct our mistake of providing them information that displays any sort of weakness later in the process.